Hello everyone, I'm coming to you from CNM's beautiful West Side campus with this video on what is history and what is historical thinking. These are two important themes and concepts that will guide us throughout the rest of this course. So we need to take some time right now to pay special attention to what those things mean. All too often we kind of take for granted what history is, how we do history. As you've already figured out from the module on learning about what history is in this first unit, history is not just a collection of dates, names, and facts. So you don't have to worry about memorizing any of those things for the purposes of this class. Usually people are pretty happy when I say that. However, as you'll find out, maybe doing history or thinking about the kinds of skills, critical thinking, detective work that it actually takes to put together the story of what happened in the past to the fullest extent possible, it takes a lot more work than just memorizing a series of names, dates, and facts. So think about your ideas of what history is, what it means to you, ways that it's crossed your path before coming to this class as you continue through this video. Next, we need to consider what makes the best historical accounts or stories and why. Which kinds of historical stories do you like to read, hear about, or watch the most? What makes them engaging? Think about this for just a minute or two, and take a minute or two to write down what your answers are to that, because you'll need to use that on the discussion board for this part of this unit. I really like David McCullough's writing style. He's an academically trained historian, but his work is very readable and approachable. He's a great storyteller. And you've also probably been asked in the past to read some historical fiction. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck is a great example of historical fiction, whether or not you like it. Also, Ave Sin Nido by a Latin American author named Clorinda Mato de Turner is a great example of this as well that we think about in modern Latin American history classes. Additionally, films can be a source of historical knowledge. Historical films include documentaries such as Farmingville or Ken Burns' The West, or any of the many different film series that Ken Burns has created for PBS and other outlets. Historical films can also include feature pictures, such as 300, 12 Years a Slave, or Young Guns, just to name a few. The important question to ask yourself then is what makes these different historical presentations appealing? Is it the entertainment factor? Is it the blood and guts? Is it the relationship stories, if you're my wife? What is it that makes history appealing? Would you prefer to watch a documentary over one of these feature films? Would you prefer to read history? Do you like historical fiction? And why is that? So just take a couple of minutes again to think about the reasons behind all of these things. For me, one of the most important things about history, whether fictional or not, is evidence. Did the author, the film producer, the director, the actors, the scriptwriters, did they use historical evidence, and how did they come to their interpretations of what happened in the past? Again, those are very important questions for us to ask ourselves as we approach history, whether at the movie theater or in this class. In order to address the question of what makes a good historical account, we also need to think about the skill of historical thinking. Essentially, what the idea of historical thinking boils down to is the idea of how we know what we know about something, what can we learn about its context, what types of questions should we ask of the past as we read through the documents and evidence that are available to us regarding the past. This chart presents us with a few of the different types of questions that historians ask as they try to figure out what happened in the past. So first, we have to think about cause and effect. You can read through the sub-questions there, but again, We have to realize which kinds of factors actually caused certain effects, which kinds of things were not related to those effects. Also, change in continuity. Those are very big questions for historians. Sometimes history is defined as the study of change over time. So if we're going to study what has changed over time, we need to also figure out what hasn't changed quite so much. Historians also look for major turning points when they're trying to figure out cause and effect, change in continuity. We also use the past in order to make sense of the present. History should be something that's very relevant to our lives today. It should be relevant to who we are and how we understand other people. One of the main reasons that I particularly think that the study of history is crucial and important and rewarding is that it helps us to see through other people's eyes. So not only do we use the past to understand ourselves, but also we can think about how people in the past viewed their world differently than we did. But to me, thinking about viewing through their eyes also encompasses the idea of looking at something through different perspectives. So how would people in different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different socioeconomic backgrounds than ourselves, how would they have looked at this situation? How were the events that they were caught up in critical in shaping the decisions that they made, the outcomes that came about? When we think about the past in these ways, it can help us to have empathy for other people and help us to put ourselves in others' shoes and understand those multiple perspectives in order to come up with the best picture, the fullest picture of what happened in the past. Believe it or not, in some ways it is helpful to think of history in terms of the problems that it presents to us. Traditionally, historians relied on written texts to tell the story of the past. The problem with that approach is that non-literate societies, such as the Inca, who used quipus to keep their records, they did not appear in history. They were considered prehistoric or not part of the historical record. Of course, we know that those people had history, so how do we tell what their history was? Historians increasingly rely on the tools of archaeologists and anthropologists, such as evidence of material culture, artifacts, to tell the story of the past for those types of people or those societies. Additionally, things like cartoons, maps, and, more recently, films can help us to understand the history of a given people or group of people. One type of historical source that I forgot to mention are oral histories or oral traditions that have been passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. Those are also used by historians to tell the past, and no matter what kind of source you're using, a critical eye, context, and analysis is essential to figure out what's at stake for the author, whether or not they're telling you something true. With so many different kinds of evidence, interpretation and the issue of historical truth are a couple of matters that we also need to think about. I love this tweet. Samuel Redman, who teaches history at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, posted this just a few days ago. You can read that. There is no such thing as unbiased history. When people demand unbiased history, they're actually demanding stories in line with their own bias. And what he's saying actually has a lot of truth to it, because anymore, historians realize that the issue of perspective is crucial when trying to figure out what happened in the past. So, as in the case of this cartoon, all of us are going to have different perspectives, not only on clouds, but also on what happened at a given time or place. If a few of us are witnesses to the same event, we're all going to tell that event slightly differently, depending on perspective, depending on what elements of that event we think are most important. So where does this leave the issue of truth? Many academic historians have reached the conclusion that there is no such thing as one overall objective truth about the past, at least insofar as we as human beings can discover it and understand it. However, that doesn't mean that we should just throw our hands up in the air and give up and say that doing history is a futile attempt. As historian Matthew Restall has put it, there are always multiple narratives of any historical moment, but that does not mean that as interpretations they cannot tell us something true. And I think his words are extremely important when thinking about the value of the past. So what we need to do then as historians is put together the evidence in such a way that will allow us to interpret based on context, based on our best knowledge, interpret the past in such a way as to capture the fullest picture of what happened from as many perspectives as possible. In this last section of the video, I want to talk just briefly about some of the ways to analyze historical writing and apply historical thinking. One of the key ways to do this is to look for a thesis statement and to evaluate it. So, as put here, a thesis is a statement of the topic and an explanation of so what. Why is that topic significant? And here we have Lisa Simpson helping us to understand what makes a successful thesis statement. It's usually one sentence, although it can be two sentences. The point is that it's concise. It should be a statement, not a question. If you've asked a question and you're writing the thesis statement, you should go back and either add a thesis statement that answers the question or else revise so that it's not a question in the first place. Of course, it should identify the subject of the paper and lay out where the paper is going. And finally, it takes a stand rather than simply announcing a subject. This next slide really discusses that last point. So think about the reasons that this thesis statement would not be effective if you're trying to get your parents to give you a car and you're 16 years old. Of course, part of the reason is that this is just an observation rather than an argument or a stance. So in historical writing and analysis, thesis statements should make an argument. And when you're reading history, whether primary or secondary sources, you should look for the thesis statement. Look for what the author is trying to convince you of, what they think you should take away, and then ask yourself, is that what I should be taking away from this evidence? Have they read the evidence correctly? Have they been critical of it in an appropriate manner? This will help you to evaluate historical analysis and historical narratives most effectively. Also, it'll help you in your own writing. So thank you for viewing this short film. Thank you for bearing with me. This is the first time I've tried Explain Everything to make a video, and I hope that it's been at least bearable, if not somewhat enjoyable.